time trying to film the start of this video. I keep losing footage. I don't know what's happening. This video is cursed, but hi, my name is Adriana, and this is a review for The Devil Colony by James Rollins. This is the 7th book in the Sigma 4 series, a series that follows a special ops team under DARPA and their crazy escapades trying to protect new and emerging technologies and keeping them from falling into the wrong hands. So we will start with a short synopsis. In the Utah wilderness, an ancient secret is unlocked. It has been protected for centuries by the Ute tribe, but now that it has been unleashed, it threatens the entire globe. As per usual in these Sigma Force books, there's always a global threat. Painter must find a way to contain this threat while also protecting his niece, who is at the site of the release protesting. This book throws it back to the founding of the United States, to the founders' relationships with the Native American tribes, as well as delves into the lore of the Mormon religion, which will lead us into the next section of this video. But before we jump into that, please consider liking and commenting on this video and subscribing to my channel if you like bookish things. This next section of the video I'm going to call my icks. If you're not familiar with the trend, the TikTok trend of an ick, it is basically usually in reference to a potential romantic partner and finding something in them, be it petty or maybe not as petty, that just like turns you off from them immediately. So this book for me, yes, these are icks, but they didn't turn me off from the book completely. Like, I am a fangirl for the Sigma 4 series. I will love it forever. And these icks range from petty to not as petty. We'll go through. It'll make sense as I go through, I assume. So the first ick I want to start with, as I kind of alluded to in the synopsis, was the use of the Mormon religion, Latter-day Saints, whatever you want to call it, especially in regards to Native American history in the US. If you are unfamiliar with the Mormon religion, it's very prevalent out here in the West. A lot of small towns with a lot of Mormons, and the church has a very bloody history out in the West. The founding of Utah was done so with much bloodshed to the local tribes. And so one of the things that kind of like, again, an ick about this book is one of the characters that are introduced, Henry Kanosh. He is a Native American man, I believe part of the Ute tribe, and is a practicing Mormon. And that is a weird dichotomy, a weird thing to try to get into as an author, especially when James Rollins has admitted that he did not grow up Mormon and did not, I don't think, is Native American. I don't know that for sure. But just kind of a, I don't know. It's a weird one. It's a weird one. And it is slightly addressed in the book, but not to the point that I think that I feel comfortable with it. So, weird. Also kind of like branching off that more into like how Native Americans are treated in this book. There is another character that is introduced that is a guy in the National Guard. I can't remember how rankings work in that setting, but he is with the National Guard and is super duper racist. And by the end, it's just kind of forgiven for that. He's just like, he goes through this traumatic experience where his life is saved by a bunch of Native American people, and he just decides, I'm not racist anymore. And I don't know if there was enough on the page done to warrant that behavior. So again, a little bit of an ick. This next ick is one that has lasted through my entire reread of the Sigma Force so far. And that is the way women are portrayed. Women are always introduced by their looks first. First, right off the bat, we find out that these women are stunningly gorgeous. And I understand that, like, this fits a specific kind of dad-lit genre, and, you know, action movies always do this, where, I mean, like, basically any movie is gonna have beautiful people in it, because all actors are beautiful people. But it's just kind of weird to have your women be purposefully introduced this way. There's like 3 characters specifically introduced, and they were all like very highly accomplished women in like a lot of pretty highly professional areas, and introducing them by their looks first just feels off. Like, I have 3 examples. I'll just list them out. The first one was this research assistant in the Library of Congress archives. So obviously a very accomplished woman to be working in one of the most important libraries in the country, and the archives of one of the most important libraries in the country, and just for no reason she's beautiful in a slinky dress when we meet her. Why? Like, why do we need to know that? Especially because, like, she only interacts in this kind of like info dumpy research assistant way. Like, she doesn't need to be pretty to do that. She could just, we don't have to know what she looks like. She could just be a faceless character. The next one is this park ranger. Again, all she does is lead the characters into some ancient Pueblo artifacts, ruins. She doesn't need to be pretty to do that, but apparently she's a Victoria's Secret model. So there we go. And then the last one I want to bring up and kind of have the most to say about is we meet this postdoc at a physics lab in Japan, and she is a leggy blonde. Is exactly how she is introduced, word for word. Like, not saying that leggy blondes can't be physicists, but like, why? And she is also been kind of put upon to be the self-insert for the reader to get all of this scientific information, and it just makes her come off as really dumb. Like, if you know anything about science, because at one point a research physicist, a full research physicist at this place, is having to explain to her what activation energy is, and like, activation energy is something you learn your freshman year of college in general chemistry. Like, a postdoc in physics would know that, would not need to have that explained to her. And so just having this woman's introduction be fully focused on her looks, and then having her come off really dumb, it just doesn't sit well. And I don't like it. And it's an ick. The next ick we're gonna get to has to do with the villains of the story, and this is where the transition is gonna happen, so just be prepared. But our main villain of the story, I normally love James Rowland's villains. They're normally like rich, billionaire, bombastic bad guys with kind of a, almost like, they have a moral compass. It's just pointed in a very weird direction, and so you can really get behind what they're doing. And this one, you don't get that. He's just a bad dude that wants to move up further in the bad guy corporate ladder, and that would be fine if he wasn't also one of the few bad guys who has a visible chronic illness. Just choosing your least good bad guy to have a visible developmental disability is just doesn't sit right. It doesn't feel good. I don't like it. I think if you're gonna give your bad guy a chronic illness, you need to be really careful with how you portray that. And I just don't think that happened here. And knowing James Rowland's histories representing other types of people, I can safely say that I don't think it was handled well in this sphere. And then one of the bad guy's henchmen is a woman with a rapey backstory to explain why she's a badass. And I hate that trope as well. Like, you don't have to give women a traumatic rapey backstory for them to be strong and fight well and just entail general badassery. So I think that finishes up my ick section. So now we are going to get to my love section, because I can recognize in myself that my favorite series on the planet is extremely problematic. And I recognize that, I speak to it, And then I also speak about the things that I love about this series. First and foremost is the characters. I love these characters. They are what keeps me coming back to this series over and over again, even with all the problems. I mentioned this in the synopsis, but the main character we are following in this book is Painter Crow. He is typically, well, still in this book, is the director of Sigma Force. So usually he's hanging back in Washington, D.C. and just kind of like telling people what to do. But this book, he dives full in because his niece gets involved. So I really love bringing in more of Painter's Native American background, especially with this book so heavily focusing on Native American history. The other main character from the Sigma Force that we are following is Gray Pierce. He is really struggling with his dad's early onset Alzheimer's diagnosis, as well as Gray's mom is dealing with her partner having early onset Alzheimer's. So really seeing kind of a grown man having to grapple with this sort of relationship with his parents, I think is handled really, really well. Surprisingly well. There are some forms of rep that I think James Rollins does really, really well, and some that I don't think he does as well, and I have to assume it probably comes from his own experiences with things, and I would appreciate if he started using some, like sensitivity readers, so the areas of representation that he's not as familiar with are just as good as the one he is. But this is not the ick section, this is the love section. We're talking about what we love, and I love Gray's relationship with his parents. I think it is so complex and interesting, and it's just so juicy and good for not being on the page all that often. And then the last character I want to bring up is a character I mentioned in my ick section, but that is Henry or Hank Kanosh, the BYU professor who is Native American and also Mormon. As much ick factor as I have with the relationship between those two things, I do think it represents a real life thing that happens. As I said, there are Native Americans who do practice LDS, and we get to spend so much time with this character that you really get to know a lot about him. Spend a lot of time with his dog. He is a professor of Native American anthropology, and so he has spent a lot of time learning about his people in the area and their practices, religious practices, societal practices, and I think it's just, he was a really cool character to introduce, especially for just a one-off character we're probably not going to see again, and I just really, really enjoyed him and his dog, because his dog was dope. The next love I had was just the settings that this all takes place in. I have spent some time in kind of wilderness areas of Utah. It is beautiful. I think James Rollins does an incredible job of describing the impeccable landscape of Utah and how much fun and how cool it is. We also spend some time in Iceland, which I have also been to. And again, the impeccable, stark beauty of that area. And then finishing up with Yellowstone National Park, which again, I have been to. I've been to all of the places listed in here, which is fun. I don't normally get to do that in a James Rollins novel because he's normally going to crazy places that I have not been to, but not this one. I've been to all of them. So it was fun to kind of get to relive my own experiences in these places through James Rollins' description of them on the page. My next, I wouldn't call this love, but maybe non-ick I have with this is some of his better representation. So one of the Sigma Force operatives, Monk, lost a hand in a previous adventure, a previous book, and he has a super fancy prosthetic from the Department of Defense. And I think James Rollins does a pretty good job of portraying this man's grief and acceptance and just kind of his daily struggles with even having this super fancy prosthetic. Just spoiler warning for all these books, the prosthetic gets blown up every single book. It has a little bit of C4 in it by design. And so usually at some point in the book, he disconnects his hand and uses the explosion of the hand as some sort of distraction to help them get out of a pinch. So the hand blows up every time. But then we usually get to delve into kind of his own mindset and how it's affected his lifestyle and his relationships, and just, so I think that kind of disability representation is done really well. It's just kind of like the chronic illness and like chronic disability that like has really poor representation. So I imagine James Rowlands writing these kinds of novels, he's probably interacted with a lot of people in the military and has a lot of people in his life that are amputees, or that he has like worked with who are amputees. So I imagine that's why that kind of disability rep is better than other kinds. But I still want to like call it out and shout it out and say I think it's handled pretty well. The other kind of representation that I think James Rowlands does pretty well is autism spectrum. And like obviously autism spectrum is such a touchy subject for so many people. So many people experience it so differently. So it's really hard to gauge if something, like nothing will ever be perfect autism rep, but I think the characters that he chooses to include it with feel lifelike and handled with care to me, in my experience, having people in my life diagnosed on the spectrum. One of the physicists in this physics lab in Japan is, I think, stated on the page that he has autism. I'm 90% sure it is stated on the page, which, number one, I think it's great that he is actually putting it on the page that this character has autism and it's not just like autism coded. And you would think that, you know, when you're saying that your physicist character like has autism, that they're going to be some sort of like Rain Man character. But this guy like isn't a perfect super physics genius. He is just a regular physicist who happens to have some symptoms, I guess social symptoms of being on the spectrum, and you get to kind of delve into his mind when he is explaining certain things and his own frustrations with why people aren't understanding the way he is trying to portray something. And I just think that's really valuable to be able to get into somebody's mind and not just see the frustration of a neurotypical person having to deal with someone who is on the spectrum, and being able to kind of like flip that script and see the frustration of someone who is neurodivergent dealing with someone who is neurotypical because it goes both ways. And then finally, I want to end off with like my favorite part of this book, and that is like the budding romance between two of our main characters, Gray and Seishon. I have read this series all the way through, so like I know what the end game is for like all of these characters, at least end game up until book 16. I really wish he had the numbers on the side of these books so I knew which book was which. But I know like up to current book end game for all of these characters and where they end up, and so it's so fun being able to see their romantic development, their relationship, like I guess non-romantic relationship development with other characters, but specifically Gray and Seishon, because they start as such direct adversaries and then get kind of like pushed together as hesitant allies, and now they're just like full allies having to put their lives in each other's hands, and there's little like winks and nods and stolen kisses in hallways, and I just love it. I love it so much. It's so good. With that all being said, I gave this book 3.5 stars out of 5, which is my, I think, lowest rated of my rereads so far, which is kind of crazy considering how much I just gushed about the things I love, but I really hold this series to a fairly high standard, and I have a weird relationship with it because sometimes the icks really drag down my rating, and sometimes I just totally ignore the icks and give it a 5-star. But this one, probably my least favorite of my rereads so far. I'm excited to be continuing on with this series, and I love it so much. So let me know if you have read any of the Sigma Force or if you are interested in picking it up. And thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you on the next video.